With the new Wuthering Heights film on the horizon, we are about to see a massive wave of new readers discovering the Brontes for the very first time. There's nothing better than watching new readers fall down the Haworth rabbit hole, like wanting to dive into the history of these literary sisters and becoming lifelong fans. I've gotten several comments asking me what my take is on the 2022 biopic Emily, which stars Emma Mackey and was directed by Frances O'Connor, about the life of Emily Bronte, the writer of Wuthering Heights. I'm finally getting around to it, and I've realized it's the perfect example of a trend that has been bothering me for years when it comes to female authors on screen. It's this idea that a woman's genius, her creativity, isn't believable unless there is a great fictionalized tragic love behind it. When we watch biopics about male creators, we're allowed to see them as like tortured and intellectual or just inherently brilliant. But for women like Emily Bronte, the industry seems to think the only explanation for Wuthering Heights is that she must have had like a secret boyfriend. To make this passionate affair work for the plot, the film didn't just invent a lover out of thin air. It kind of erased the one Bronte sister who actually might have had these experiences and whose real life influence truly shaped Emily's work. Today, we are talking about why we need to stop giving female authors fake boyfriends just to justify their talent. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I'm Kayla, and here on the channel, I talk about period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And I know what your burning question really is, which sister is my favorite? Everyone's got a favorite, and I know it's not overly obvious. All I gotta say is I am not going to go into a 15-minute rant about how dirty this film did Charlotte Bronte and leave it at that. It's irrelevant to this conversation. Well, kind of. We are in our Wuthering Heights era. Nobody cares about your problematic relationship with Jane Eyre, Kayla. Emily is a film that positions itself less as a historical record and more as a full-blooded Gothic fable as described by critic Mark Kermode. But the primary goal of this film was to kind of speculatively explore the roots of Emily's literary genius. This approach led to a generally favorable critical reception, with many praising it as fervently imagined and beautifully acted. The director has framed the project as being inspired by rather than factually based on the Brontes, leaving me in a position yet again on this channel where I am personally torn over a period drama. I can appreciate the artistry of, the speculative storytelling. Goodness knows I'm gonna have to lean into that when it comes to this new Wuthering Heights. But I find myself pushing back against the idea that we must invent a secret life to justify a woman's creativity. If you don't know much about Emily's life or the Brontes, she was raised in the somewhat isolated parsonage of Haworth in Yorkshire with her two sisters. Others died before. It's a whole thing. This poor, tragic family. But she lived with Charlotte and Anne and their brother Bronwell, and they were the daughters of a clergyman named Patrick Bronte. Most of their lives were confined to the rugged, windswept Yorkshire moors and a constant looming proximity to death due to poor sanitation and the prevalence of diseases like tuberculosis and cholera. The average life expectancy in Haworth at the time was shockingly low, and that's a video for another time. Their financial situation was always precarious, which eventually pushed the sisters into roles as governesses, which was also a life of social isolation and drudgery that they largely detested. Meanwhile, their only brother Bronwell spiraled into a devastating cycle of addiction and mental health struggles that cast a dark shadow over the household. So at times it was a very tumultuous life. Emily was famously reclusive and deeply attached to the moors, but also apparently very independent in her little, radius of life. That self-imposed isolation and her intense stoic nature was really the hallmarks of who she was. She was a bit of a mystery even to the people who actually knew her. And then she died at just 30 years old, having barely stepped foot outside of her family circle. It's always been this huge point of fascination that this woman who never married and lived a life completely devoid of any scandalous romance, could produce something as raw as Wuthering Heights. For a lot of people, it seems impossible that a virginal daughter of a person could write something so devastating and emotionally charged. The biopic Emily centers on her intense bond with her brother Bronwell and her growing clandestine attraction to the family's new curate, William Weightman. As the two engage in a series of secret encounters and intellectual disagreements, sparring basically, the film suggests that this forbidden, passionate awakening is the primary catalyst that eventually inspires Emily to write the masterpiece that is Wuthering Heights. So William Weightman, he was real. He arrived in Haworth in August 1839 to serve as Patrick Bronte's new curate. And honestly, for the sisters, it must have felt exciting for, 3 single young women in a remote northern town to suddenly have a handsome, highly educated, graduate from Durham University on their doorstep. Charlotte was 23, Emily was 21, Anne was 19. By contemporary accounts during the time, he was charming, he was cheerful, he was a notorious flirt, which... naughty for a man of the cloth. But he was well liked by the family, even if the sisters were sometimes miffed with his flirtatious ways. He became friends with Bronwell, who was suffering with addiction. Patrick Bronte grew fond of him when, by all accounts, he disliked several of his other curates. This is just my opinion. This is not historical record. I get the feeling from things written by Charlotte that, perhaps all 3 sisters had a little crush on him in the beginning, and he was probably a bit flirtatious and ambiguous with all 3 of them, which made them have conflicting feelings about him. He also might have had a connection with another woman back home, which might have stirred some drama for the young ladies of Haworth. But overall, he was liked by the family. Charlotte drew a portrait of him and look at these chops. I wouldn't be mad if we brought back whatever he's got going on here, and waistcoats and tall boots and flowy white shirts and... you can roll them up by the sleeves and... Sorry, I got distracted. In one of the most famous stories about him, he found out that the Bronte sisters had never received Valentine's cards, so he walked 10 miles to Bradford just to post anonymous ones to all 3 of them and their friend Ellen to give them a bit of excitement. If that is not a bit of F-boy energy, I don't know what is. Some scholars, this is not proven, I keep wanting to make sure that I point that out here on the channel, but some speculate that Anne and William might have had some sort of attachment. In Charlotte's letters, she teased Anne about her Bonnie Weightman and observed them sitting together in the parsonage, noting that they were a picture of mutual shy affection. It's also well documented that Anne was the one who seemed most affected by his charm. She was the baby of the family, and his light-hearted, notorious flirt energy seemed to draw her in. The most heartbreaking clues, however, are found in Anne's writing. Spoiler alert, Weightman died of cholera after attending to the sick in Haworth in 1842, when he was just 26 years old. I could go on and on about the tragedies that this family suffered over their lifetime. It is awful. But Anne wrote several deeply melancholic poems, including I Will Not Mourn Thee, Lovely One, and A Reminiscence. These pieces speak of a profound, quiet grief for a lost companion that scholars have long thought could be Weightman. Unlike the explosive, fictionalized drama of the movie, the reality was likely a gentle, developing romance that was cut short by tragedy. A loss that may have been the real catalyst for the emotional depth found in Agnes Grey, which also includes a friendly curate. In Patrick Bronte's funeral sermon for Weightman, he talked about how tragic it was that William was cut down in the prime of his life and how much of an impact that he had on Haworth. The movie builds its entire emotional arc around a passionate sexual affair between Emily and William Weightman. Yet, historically, there is no concrete evidence that they ever shared a romantic relationship. Director Frances O'Connor has admitted that she took imaginative leaps to fill the gaps. It leaves us with the same frustrating question raised by many in the Bronte fandom. Why conjure this obviously fictional romance at all? Especially one that might have co-opted Anne's story instead and made her invisible. It feels as though the production found it impossible to accept that a woman could create Wuthering Heights through the power of her own mind without a doomed physical romance to explain it away. What I will say is that this film is beautiful. It handles the kind of gothic, dark, spooky, macabre side of Yorkshire well, which I think can be really hard sometimes to capture on screen. There is something that can be really twisted, weird, mystical about the Victorian era, like their obsession with mourning and the dead and the afterlife that is deeply unsettling and borderline obsessive that I feel like is not captured well in period dramas. It's mostly fashion and glittery balls and swooshing hoop skirts and doesn't really cover the heavier, morbid side of that era. And I feel like this film did really lean in well with all of that. There's some really eerie scenes of Emily grieving her mother and a seance that captures that kind of obsession with ghosts and group hysteria with Victorians really well, I thought. You've got these rugged, sweeping shots of the moors, the flicker of candlelight that shows you just how unlit, most of the day would have been in England, how that might have affected people's moods. The score is thunderous and moody. I do think this film gets the Brontë tone of Yorkshire down pretty well. The costuming feels more lived in and real to the time period. It's not all pristine bonnets and perfectly pressed lace. It's muddy, it's practical at times, and it captures that gritty isolation of Haworth. One of the strongest parts of the film, for me, is Emma Mackey's performance. She plays a very multi-layered Emily who is isolated and introverted, but also one who is a bit rebellious and emotional. There's also an unease to her relationship with Bronwell that feels messy and intense and maybe a bit codependent. This is not a film that wraps Emily Bronte up in a perfect little bow with reasonable or rational decision-making all of the time. I also appreciated how the film explores her social anxiety and what we might today call neurodivergence. It doesn't slap a modern diagnosis on her, but it shows her maybe masking or retreating into herself in a way that feels very empathetic, treats her solitude not as a weakness, but as the fuel for her creativity, which I really liked, especially as an introvert myself. I can see the ways that Frances O'Connor was attempting to create a film that was more of a tribute to Emily's spirit than a straight-up biography. And I will say that this fictional version of her, there was good chemistry between Emma Mackey and Oliver Jackson Cohen, who played William Weightman, and this beautiful atmospheric story that I did enjoy watching. Some people will defend Emily by saying, it's just a fictional biopic, that it never claimed to be 100% factual documentary. And look, I get that. Imagination is important in filmmaking. We're all used to a little dramatization to make stories feel more exciting on screen. But I'd argue that even speculative biopics carry a real responsibility, especially when they choose to overwrite historical nuance to fit a more marketable narrative. At the end of Emily, I think it's Charlotte who asks her, how did you write Wuthering Heights right before Emily dies? And she says that she was in love with Weightman. And that was essentially how she was able to write Wuthering Heights, that her last statement on this earth was kind of fulfilling that mystery for the people around her of this was how I was able to create this masterpiece. I was in love. The harm is that when you center a totally fictional affair as the primary source of a woman's creativity, you risk trivializing her actual life. It suggests that Emily Bronte, a woman of intellectual depth and emotion, needed a man to experience passion with before she could write about it. Some might say that adding a romance makes the film more accessible or emotionally engaging for a modern audience. But at what point does it feel like one sister's story becomes invisible simply to be able to use it so the more marketable, famous sister can sell tickets in the theater? It just feels like a step too far, honestly. It's a choice that literally steals Anne's potential love story and her actual inspiration and hands it over to her more famous sister. There will be some people who watch this film who have watched other, wildly inaccurate films and think this was genuinely how Wuthering Heights was written. I could see the kind of like the rule book for this film the second that William Weightman stepped onto the screen. It felt like a total repeat in a way of like becoming Jane. It takes Tom Lefroy, a man Jane certainly knew and likely had a crush on for maybe a few weeks, and turns him into the great lost love of her life who must have inspired all of her novels. The problem is that Becoming Jane was so successful at this that there's now a group of people who genuinely believe that that is Austen's true biography. They think she was a woman whose works were defined by a failed romance with a charming Irishman, rather than a brilliant, sharp-witted social commentator of the world around her. There are other female biopics like Miss Potter or even Mary Shelley, where the industry feels this desperate need to make female writers relatable by tying their genius to a man in some way, shape, or form. And not to say that our relationships don't impact our lives or that, the people we love can inspire our creativity, but it feels like in a lot of ways these type of biopics have these women's love lives define their creativity, and not that that was just another part of their lives. The reality is that for women like Jane Austen or Emily Bronte, more than likely it's the people around them that might have inspired any romance-adjacent storylines in their works. Why are we so uncomfortable with the idea that a woman can be inspired by her own intellect, her family, or her observations of society? When it's done to women, it promotes this tired trope that a female literary mind is only activated by a sexual or romantic awakening. We don't need to lean on these like lazy romantic arcs to make a story more interesting. There are some series that have moved away from this, which I have found really refreshing. I spoke about this more in depth in my Best Period Dramas of 2025 video. Miss Austen focuses on the profound relationship between Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra and her wider family. To Walk Invisible, which focuses on all three Bronte sisters, might be one of the most like heart-wrenching, like a little too real period dramas that I have ever seen. But I think to really capture the hardship in the Brontes' lives, it's unfortunately necessary. It was written by Sally Wainwright, a West Yorkshire native who you might know as the screenwriter for Gentleman Jack. That's another amazing female-focused Yorkshire set series that I highly, highly recommend. Because Sally Wainwright is from the area, she captures like Yorkshire society and the brutal landscape and the local history with just this level of grit and authenticity that you do not get in these glossy biopics, and sometimes in a lot of Bronte adaptations. I really think she understands the Yorkshire landscape and how it really weaves into the different stories of the Bronte sisters. I also think she really understood that perhaps the best way to understand the Bronte sisters is to not separate out their stories, but make their connection with each other the focal point for audiences to understand their creative processes. It does a better job at not villainizing one sister for the other, although Charlotte also had a hand in erasing her sister. And if you know, you know. Love you, Charlotte. You know you're a bit manipulative. Okay, girlfriend? There was a focus on the crushing weight of their brother's addiction, the isolation of the parsonage, and the sheer force of will it took for these three sisters to get published as women in the 1800s. These works prove that you don't need to center a rom-com narrative to make these women compelling. When you strip away the fake boyfriends and the looming husbands, you're left with something much more fascinating, which is the actual lived reality of female genius, which is much more interesting of a story to tell. And I feel like it's more inspiring for young women. The adaptations that I have watched where the focus has been, women getting published despite the odds, or, she gets into a university that women had never been allowed to be in previously, or like when Elle Woods solves her court case at the end of Legally Blonde. How much more satisfying was that film because she actually put the work in and found out that she was a good student and a talented lawyer? Was it sweet that she also found a love story? Sure, but no one thinks that the central storyline of Legally Blonde is her finding a man. It's her becoming a lawyer and doing it with dumb blonde hair and hot pink clothing and stilettos. And that is what makes that film a classic and women feeling empowered when they watch Legally Blonde. Not her having a side boyfriend. What is frustrating about films like Legally Blonde is that it's a story about, professional progression and someone finding out who they truly are and what they're capable of. But it is categorized as a rom-com, which has all of these separate connotations and puts it in the let's not treat this as seriously as other films. And that is another reason why it frustrates me that this Emily biopic is centered around a romance, because even though it's not a rom-com, now what is this categorized as? A romance, right? Like people will associate this film, even though it's supposed to be a biopic, they will associate it with it being a romance film. When really these stories are supposed to be about a woman's journey and what she learns and how she's impacted, not her love life. A biopic centered on Anne, or even a historically grounded version of Emily, could have explored a much more profound type of creativity for these women. It could have been a story rooted in solitude and sharp observation and, the quiet grief of having to live a limited life. If the filmmakers really wanted a Bronte love story, Anne's would have made so much more sense to me, and it would have given her more of a spotlight. Anne is often regarded as the invisible or overlooked third sister. She also wrote quite a radical book at the time, The Tenet of Walthall Hall. That book is gritty and is considered one of the first, if not the first, books that tackles domestic abuse. It is much more of a relatable story for women of the time period than a man having a wife locked up in the attic. Not to say that that's not a thing that didn't happen, and the amount of women that were put into asylums for no reason at all. But I feel like The Tenet of Walthall Hall was probably a very real experience for a lot of women, that they didn't have other people to talk to about or ways to get out of those situations. But there's so many ways this could have still been a theatrical release, a big budget film, and have it be about Anne, who was also living through very similar situations as Emily, also struggling with mental health, also, her general health and having to be a governess with little prospects. Her story and her writings could have been impactful for audiences. They didn't need to essentially shoehorn Emily and Wuthering Heights just to sell a film. To me, it's odd that this director wanted to have Emily essentially in place of Anne, and I suspect it's because Emily was the more famous sister, as if people wouldn't go to a film if it's about a historical figure that they don't really know. That happens all the time. When we think of some of the major films that have come out throughout the years about historical figures that become Oscar-winning, buzz-worthy films, they're oftentimes about figures that people know nothing about, and all of a sudden now we know things about this new figure. I'm thinking of a new film that's coming out, The Testament of Ann Lee, which is about the founder of the Shakers. And that film is creating a lot of buzz. Nobody knows who Ann Lee is, but they will now. Now that this film is coming out, they are going to know about this figure. How many people knew the general plot of Alexander Hamilton's life before Hamilton? Not very many. So I think it's silly that there's this idea that with this specific film, we needed to have Emily be shoehorned into Anne's life in order to sell this film. I think it would have made it so much richer, especially for people like me who, after you see those types of films, you go and you start searching the history of everything, and you get down a rabbit hole and you get obsessed with the relationships that these people might have had, that sort of thing. And then to find out that none of it's real, it's kind of like, well, what was the point of all that? To just branding and marketing? I don't know. It feels a bit shallow. Look, there will always be a part of me that loves like Becoming Jane and this idea that she had a blip of a real love just once in her life before entering spinsterhood. And in some way, it's also satisfying to see Emily here experience a passionate attachment, some sort of brief happiness before she dies way too young. But I feel like I would almost rather these be like My Lady Jane, where the alternate history is so outlandish and so far from the truth that you can actually enjoy the ride and it can be abundantly clear that it's fiction. You can let yourself escape, not assume that because of everything else, the costuming, the sets, etc., that you're supposed to be lured into a false sense of historical accuracy when the main storyline is anything but. We should be able to celebrate a woman who was strange or solitary and brilliant without needing to give her a defining romance to make her worthy of a biopic, when there are countless biopics of men where that is not the central narrative. I feel like this idea that these sisters living limited lives or not having children, Anne and Emily never marrying, living in precarious financial situations, not being relatable to modern society is silly. I think their stories can be highly relatable in these days and times. At the end of the day, Emily is a beautiful Gothic fever dream. If you view it as a total work of fiction, a standalone what-if story, it's an enjoyable watch. And I will not judge you if you're like, after you see Wuthering Heights, you're like, I want to see this film and see a little bit more into Emily Bronte's personality. And I want to escape a bit more into, Bronte's Yorkshire. I get it. But as a biopic, it feels like it does a disservice to all the Bronte sisters, to be honest. More honest biopics like To Walk Invisible are a much harder watch. It's dark and it's painful and it doesn't offer the temporary escapism of a secret romance. But because of that, it feels honest. It's a bittersweet, grounded way to actually understand why these Gothic Yorkshire stories were as tragic and as raw as they were. I'd much rather sit with the difficult, uncomfortable truth of their lives than a polished fiction that suggests they needed a man to become who they were. Well, that is it for me, guys. What did you think? Are you bothered by this type of biopic? Who else wants a high-budget biopic about the real Anne Bronte now? I would really love a new Tenet of Wallfall Hall. I really think it would impact audiences today. If you haven't read that one, check it out. We are in Bronte season. I'm going to read Agnes Grey for the first time. I'm really excited about it. I don't know why I haven't read it before. Comment below your thoughts on this biopic, and please do give me more suggestions. This is really helpful of what other period dramas that you would love for me to cover in the future. Oh, and I'm really bad at mentioning this. Please consider subscribing and helping out this little channel to grow. I love you, period drama besties. Okay, bye!